By the early 20th century, Europe stood at the peak of its power. Vast empires stretched across continents, commanding armies of millions and economies of extraordinary wealth. The British Empire spanned a quarter of the globe. The German Empire, unified only in 1871, had grown into an industrial and military titan. The Austro-Hungarian Empire held together dozens of ethnic groups under a single aging crown. The Russian Empire stretched from Eastern Europe deep into Asia. And the Ottoman Empire, though crumbling at its edges, still controlled vast territories across the Middle East and North Africa. On the surface, this was a continent of grand palaces, booming cities, and technological marvels. Steam trains crossed mountain ranges, telegraphs connected capitals in seconds, factories produced steel, weapons, and wealth at an unprecedented scale. But beneath this glittering surface, the foundations were cracking. Nationalism was rising across the continent, with ethnic groups demanding independence and self-determination. Military alliances had divided Europe into two armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood the Triple Entente, binding together France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances were designed to provide security, but they had created a mechanism where a single conflict between two nations could drag the entire continent into war. Military planners across Europe had already drawn up detailed war plans. Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, designed to fight a two-front war by rapidly defeating France in the west before turning east to face Russia. Every major power had mobilization schedules, troop deployments, and battle strategies ready to execute at a moment's notice. The arms race between Britain and Germany had produced the most powerful naval fleets in history. Colonial rivalries in Africa and Asia had already brought European powers to the brink of conflict multiple times in the decade before 1914. The continent was a powder keg. It needed only a single spark. That spark arrived on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a territory recently annexed by Austria-Hungary. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in the city with his wife Sophie for an official visit. The streets were lined with crowds, but among them moved a group of young Serbian nationalists belonging to a secret society known as the Black Hand. Their mission was to assassinate the Archduke and strike a blow against Austro-Hungarian rule over Slavic peoples. The first assassination attempt that morning failed when a bomb thrown at the Archduke's motorcade bounced off the vehicle and exploded under a following car. Franz Ferdinand continued to the town hall, shaken but unharmed. It was on the return journey when the motorcade took an unplanned route and stopped just meters from a 19-year-old assassin named Gavrilo Princip that history changed forever. Princip fired 2 shots at close range. Franz Ferdinand was struck in the jugular vein. Sophie was hit in the abdomen. Within the hour, both were dead. The assassination sent shockwaves across Europe. In Vienna, the Austro-Hungarian government saw this not merely as a criminal act, but as a direct challenge backed by Serbia. Diplomatic cables flew between capitals. Germany issued Austria-Hungary a so-called blank check, promising unconditional support for whatever action it chose to take. The machinery of alliance and mobilization, built over decades, began to turn. The weeks following the assassination became known as the July Crisis, a period of frantic diplomacy, ultimatums, and miscalculations that would pull an entire civilization into catastrophe. Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum so deliberately harsh that it was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted nearly every demand, but hesitated on one point of sovereignty. That was enough. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, bound by pan-Slavic solidarity and its own imperial interests, began mobilizing its massive army in support of Serbia. Germany, honoring its commitment to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, allied with Russia, was drawn in next. Germany then executed the Schlieffen Plan, invading neutral Belgium to outflank French defenses. That act of aggression brought Great Britain into the war, as Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality under an 1839 treaty. Within 6 weeks of a single assassination, the 5 greatest powers in Europe were at war. Animated maps of the period show alliance lines snapping into place like dominoes falling across the continent. Troops mobilized by the millions. Trains carried soldiers to fronts stretching from the English Channel to the Russian steppes. Leaders on all sides told their men they would be home before the leaves fell. They were catastrophically wrong. The war that generals had imagined as swift and glorious ground to a halt within months. On the Western Front, both sides dug into the earth, creating a network of trenches that eventually stretched over 700 kilometers from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Life in the trenches was a study in misery. Soldiers lived in narrow ditches of mud, often knee-deep in water during the wet seasons. Rats the size of small cats fed on food scraps, and worse. Lice-infested uniforms and hair. The smell of decay was constant and inescapable. Disease claimed as many lives as enemy fire. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, rotted soldiers' feet. Shell shock, what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, shattered the minds of men subjected to relentless artillery bombardment. A typical day in the trenches began before dawn with the stand-to, when every soldier manned the fire step with rifle ready, watching for enemy movement in the gray half-light. Then came the routine of maintenance, carrying supplies, repairing damaged sections of trench, and waiting. Always waiting. At night, small patrols crept into the no-man's land between the opposing lines, a barren wasteland of shell craters, barbed wire, and unburied dead. The psychological weight of living so close to death day after day, month after month, was immeasurable. Yet soldiers endured, sustained by camaraderie, dark humor, letters from home, and a stubborn human will to survive. The Western Front became the stage for some of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Battle of the Marne in September 1914 halted the German advance into France and established the trench lines that would define the war for the next 4 years. The Battle of Verdun, fought from February to December 1916, became a symbol of industrial-scale slaughter. France and Germany together suffered nearly 1 million casualties in 10 months of fighting. Despite the enormous loss of life, neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough, and Verdun ultimately remained under French control. The Battle of the Somme, launched on July 1, 1916, produced the single deadliest day in British military history. On that first day alone, nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. By the time the battle ended in November, over 1 million men on both sides had become casualties. Animated maps show the front lines barely moving despite these staggering losses. Commanders on both sides believed that one more massive offensive would break the enemy's will. They were wrong, again and again. The war had exposed the catastrophic mismatch between 19th century military thinking and 20th century industrial killing power. World War I was the first truly industrial war, and it introduced weapons that would redefine warfare forever. Machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, made frontal infantry assaults suicidal. Poison gas, first used by Germany in 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres, introduced a new dimension of horror. Chlorine and mustard gas drifted across trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes, leaving soldiers to die in agony. Flamethrowers cleared enemy positions in terrifying bursts of fire. Artillery had evolved into weapons of mass destruction, with shells capable of obliterating entire positions in seconds. The tank, introduced by Britain in 1916, was designed specifically to cross trenches and crush barbed wire, offering a potential solution to the stalemate. Aircraft evolved rapidly from fragile reconnaissance machines into dedicated fighters and bombers, with pilots engaging in aerial duels that captured the public imagination even as the war below remained grinding and merciless. Beneath the ocean, German submarines, known as U-boats, waged unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping, threatening to strangle Britain's supply lines and drawing the world's attention toward a new and deadly dimension of modern conflict. While Europe bled on the western and eastern fronts, the war spread across the globe. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, opening fronts across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. The Gallipoli Campaign of 1915 saw Allied forces, including troops from Australia and New Zealand, attempt to knock the Ottomans out of the war by seizing the Dardanelles Strait. The campaign became a disaster, costing over 500,000 casualties on both sides. In Mesopotamia, British and Indian forces fought for control of what is now Iraq. In Palestine, British General Edmund Allenby led a campaign that would ultimately dismantle Ottoman power in the Arab world. In Africa, German colonial forces fought Allied troops across vast territories. Naval warfare raged across the Atlantic and the North Sea, culminating in the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the largest naval engagement in history, where the British and German fleets clashed with enormous losses but no decisive outcome. The war had become truly global, drawing in soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and dozens of other nations into a conflict that had begun with 2 shots fired in a Balkan city. For the first 3 years of the war, the United States maintained a policy of neutrality. But 2 events in 1917 made continued neutrality impossible. Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting all ships, including American vessels, outraged the American public and government. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German diplomatic message intercepted by British intelligence, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, promising Mexico the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American entry brought fresh troops, vast industrial resources, and a psychological boost to exhausted Allied forces. By mid-1918, American soldiers were arriving in France at the rate of 10,000 per day. Meanwhile, Russia collapsed into revolution. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 led to Russia's withdrawal from the war, freeing German forces to concentrate entirely on the Western Front. Germany launched a massive spring offensive in 1918, pushing deeper into France than at any point since 1914. But the offensive exhausted Germany's last reserves. When the Allies counterattacked in August 1918 with the 100 Days Offensive, the German lines finally broke. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning on August 8, 1918, was the most decisive military campaign of the entire war. Allied forces, now reinforced by over 1 million American troops, combined tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry in a new form of coordinated warfare that shattered German defenses. Town after town was liberated. German forces retreated in disarray. Back in Germany, the home front was collapsing under the weight of Allied naval blockades that had caused widespread food shortages and civilian suffering. Mutinies broke out in the German Navy. Revolution spread through German cities. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9, 1918. 2 days later, at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France. Across Europe, church bells rang for the first time in years. Crowds poured into the streets of Paris, London, and New York. Soldiers in the trenches sat in stunned silence, unable to process the sudden absence of sound after 4 years of constant bombardment. The Great War was over. Approximately 17 million people had died. 20 million more had been wounded. An entire generation had been consumed. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 brought together the victorious Allied powers to determine the shape of the post-war world. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, imposed devastating terms on Germany. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war under the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231. It was stripped of territory, including Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, and large portions of its eastern lands given to the newly created Poland. Its military was reduced to 100,000 men, and it was burdened with reparations set at 132 billion gold marks, placing enormous economic pressure on Germany in the years that followed. The League of Nations was created as an international body to prevent future wars, but the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty, leaving the organization fatally weakened from its very first day. The old empires had collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved into multiple new nations. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered, with its Arab territories divided between Britain and France under secret agreements that drew borders with little regard for the peoples living within them, borders whose consequences are still felt today. The map of Europe and the Middle East had been redrawn entirely, but the peace was fragile, built on humiliation, economic ruin, and unresolved grievances. In Germany, a generation of young men returned home defeated, impoverished, and furious. The conditions that would give rise to Adolf Hitler, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the Second World War were being assembled in real time. As the world map transitions from 1918 to 1939, the terrible logic becomes clear. The Treaty of Versailles did not end the conflict. It merely paused it. The guns had fallen silent. But peace would last only 21 years. The next war would be even deadlier.